It is often said that some figures from the darkest chapters of true crime history leave little behind but footprints of mystery. One such individual, known for vanishing from the world stage with a rumored fortune, has captivated dedicated observers for decades. His name was Frank Larry Matthews, and his story represents one of the most compelling tales of organized crime in the United States. Enthusiasts of real mafia stories frequently mention him in the same breath as more famous underworld personalities, yet his name drifts through the annals of criminal legend relatively quietly. Even so, for those who have dared to look deep into his journey, it is impossible not to sense a strange magnetism. The path of Frank Matthews leads from poverty in the South to the ranks of the nation's richest notorious kingpins, culminating in a disappearance that has never been conclusively resolved. He wasn't just a small-time operator. Some investigators of his era came to consider him among the top 10 drug traffickers in American history. The questions swirl. How does a young man achieve dominance over one of the largest heroin and cocaine operations the Eastern Seaboard had ever seen, then skip town and disappear forever? Did he flee overseas? Or did he succumb to a more sinister fate, orchestrated by those he once threatened? This story brims with underworld secrets, rumored corruption, ambitions of an immense scale, and a figure who seemed to be as fearless as he was resourceful. To understand how Frank Matthews placed himself at the center of one of the most infamous syndicates in the 1960s and 70s, and to appreciate how he managed to slip from the grasp of the law, you have to start from the very beginning. Early life in Durham. Frank Larry Matthews was born on February 13, 1944, in Durham, North Carolina. This small city, rooted in a complex history of segregation, was also recognized for its African-American community's entrepreneurial streak. At a time when racial barriers were painfully evident, Durham's black business class propelled itself to significant prominence, fostering a local culture of aspiration and financial independence. Frank's beginnings, however, were not nearly so prosperous. He grew up in dire poverty, in one of the area's most impoverished neighborhoods. The details of his parentage are murky. His father never assumed a place in his life, and his mother passed away when he was only 4 years old. Nearby relatives, particularly one of his aunts, took Frank under their wing, raising him as if he were their own child. Accounts of Frank's childhood can be contradictory, largely because no single figure seemed to keep thorough track of his development. Neighbors remember a quiet but strong-willed boy who had an unusual knack for drawing others under his influence. He apparently stood out among his youthful peers as a leader who refused to let his environment define his boundaries. With an indescribable charisma, Frank often impressed other children into following him, whether onto the neighborhood basketball courts or into more mischief-laden corners of local life. Durham at this time was a tapestry of contrasts. There were affluent black business owners on Black Wall Street, but there were also families living on pennies a day. Surrounded by these extremes, Frank gleaned that money bestowed influence, control, and the power to transcend your station. That message, repeated daily in the segregated South, sank deep into his psyche. As he inched toward adolescence, he began rejecting the classroom environment. One teacher later recalled that Frank rarely seemed engaged with his studies. Friends from Durham described how Frank's thirst for street smarts outweighed book learning. Even so, nothing in these earliest chapters of his story predicted how far he would eventually go. Ventures into petty crime. By the time Frank grew into his teenage years, something changed fundamentally in his approach to life. Many who grew up close to him recalled a calm but determined presence, describing him as quick to spot an opportunity and unafraid to take risks. Almost inevitably, that ambition led him toward petty delinquency. A scattered set of local rumors mention him dabbling in small-scale theft, from stolen chickens at local farms to back-alley scuffles and hustles. His first brush with formal law enforcement appears to have happened around the age of 14, when he was apprehended over a theft incident. He served some form of juvenile punishment, though the details remain hazy. However, it appears Frank quickly learned from his mistakes, regaining a low profile and forging new pursuits in the underworld. People who knew him in those days remarked how he carefully balanced generosity and intimidation. He would share stolen goods, or money gleaned from questionable sources, with friends or loved ones when they were in need, all while demonstrating a capacity for intimidation whenever threatened. Allegedly, if someone crossed him, he could respond with menacing ferocity. For a time, Frank signed up at a local barber's school in Durham, leading acquaintances to believe he might pursue a legitimate profession. Yet even there, rumors circulated that he was caught pilfering clippers or other supplies, resulting in him leaving within a matter of months. Whether that is fact or myth, it reflects the widely held perception that Frank had bigger plans and would not be confined by a humble living in his hometown. By the early 1960s, still in his teens, Frank left Durham entirely, forging a path toward larger cities where the stakes and the rewards would be far greater. Explorations in Philadelphia. Frank's first major stop was the bustling city of Philadelphia. He was intrigued by the hustle and bustle, the array of illicit gaming rackets, and the relative anonymity that a teen runaway from North Carolina could enjoy. A short stint led him into the environment of numbers running, also known as the illegal lottery. This shady enterprise, which flourished in neighborhoods from Harlem to Philly, frequently survived on police corruption. Predatory officers and city officials would turn a blind eye in exchange for kickbacks. There, Frank apparently resumed the trade of barbering to maintain a veneer of respectability. Simultaneously, he got to know local numbers collectors, some with bigger aspirations. Stories swirl about him forging connections with like-minded individuals, people who saw the illegal lottery as merely a stepping stone to more profitable and dangerous forms of organized crime. In Philadelphia, Frank witnessed the profits that could be drawn from illicit gambling. He began forging relationships that would help pave his later success in the drug distribution world. Though Philadelphia offered a platform from which to learn the interplay of street hustle and political corruption, it wasn't quite big enough for what Frank had in mind. Sometime around 1963 or 1964, he made the pivot to the most tempting city for an ambitious outlaw on the East Coast, New York. Ascent in Brooklyn. Once in New York, Frank settled in Brooklyn. Still barely out of his teens, he began carving out a reputation as a resourceful hustler. At first, his daily routine looked no different from what he had practiced in Philadelphia. He cut hair, organized illegal bets, and did low-profile hustling. But inside, he was on the lookout for an even better opportunity. That opportunity arose when Frank recognized the limitless profits swirling around heroin and cocaine. By the mid to late 1960s, true crime circles across the city whispered about the infiltration of these highly addictive narcotics. Heroin use was reaching epidemic proportions in certain black communities, creating not just widespread misery but, for unscrupulous dealers, a chance at staggering wealth. For many smaller-time operators, stepping into the drug trade meant bowing to the demands of the city's reigning crime families. Organized primarily under the so-called Five Families, the Gambino, Lucchese, Bonanno, Genovese, and Colombo groups, the Italian Mafia, also referred to collectively as the Cosa Nostra, staked an entrenched claim over the importation and wholesale distribution of narcotics. African-American dealers, if they aspired to climb beyond the small-time street corner, had to buy their supply from, and therefore remain indebted to, some faction of the mafia. A few individuals, such as the legendary Bumpy Johnson or later Frank Lucas, had found ways to mitigate mafia influence, but stepping entirely free from the stranglehold of the Five Families was extremely rare. Frank Matthews, as events would show, fully intended to chart his own path. Breaking from mafia control, true to form, Frank tried to align himself with the Gambino and Bonanno lines of supply in his earliest attempts. He approached them with a proposal to buy drugs at scale, presumably hoping to secure favorable terms and then create his own distribution pipeline. Yet, for uncertain reasons, the mafia gatekeepers refused him. Unlike many others who might have bowed their heads and retreated, Frank refused to quit. He simply pivoted to other potential suppliers. One such break came courtesy of a local figure known as Spanish Raymond. This Harlem-based operator had a deep reach in the underground lottery scene. Through him, Frank made contact with an influential Cuban trafficker named Ed Rolando Gonzalez Nunez. By all reports, Nunez was then a prominent figure in the cocaine business, smuggling product from Latin America into the greater New York region. According to rumors, Frank's first big buy was a kilo of cocaine for $20,000. This single transaction eventually ballooned into a massive and highly profitable arrangement. Núñez would ship both cocaine and heroin from South America, and Frank would oversee their distribution in and around New York. Amazingly, within a single year, Frank Matthews grew from a neighborhood hustler to one of New York's most formidable narcotics dealers. Today, that speed of rising to power and that skill at cutting out the mafia middlemen remain legendary in dark history circles. But Frank was not satisfied with dealing only with Cuban sources. Recognizing the unpredictability of supply lines, he soon expanded his quest for contacts beyond any single nationality. Some accounts suggest that Frank developed ties with the infamous French Connection, a network that moved opium from the Middle East to French laboratories, where it would be processed into heroin. Then, cooperating with various criminal intermediaries, they would funnel the finished product to the U.S. This arrangement had fueled much of the American heroin epidemic in the 50s and 60s. With these broader pipelines, Frank managed to secure both higher quality goods and cheaper wholesale prices, allowing him to undercut some competitors. While the Italian Mafia tended to maintain consistently high prices for narcotics, Frank reportedly upended that norm by selling better quality heroin for less. Word on the street spread like wildfire, drawing a wide array of smaller dealers to buy from him. In this way, his distribution empire began to expand beyond New York, eventually finding inroads into over 20 states. Investigators and prosecutors alike concluded that, while he never took hold of the entire country, he might have succeeded had events not interrupted his progress. Building a criminal empire. Frank's financial growth was explosive. Some estimates claim he was raking in $600,000 per day during his peak, an astronomical sum for the early 1970s. Over about 4 or 5 years, he amassed a personal fortune sometimes quoted around $300 million, which, when adjusted for modern inflation, could be in the realm of $2 billion. These figures remain contestable, but whatever the precise amount, it's clear that the proceeds from his illicit trade were colossal. Initially, Frank kept a low profile. He reportedly resided in a modest apartment, dressed unassumingly, and refrained from ostentatious purchases. But as money poured in, he allowed himself to adopt a more flamboyant lifestyle. He started wearing expensive suits, smoking cigars, driving luxury vehicles, and seeking out wealthy enclaves. One of his boldest moves was purchasing a lavish home in Tot Hill, a wealthy area of Staten Island, inhabited by some of the empire's most powerful mafia bosses, including a man who would become the infamous Big Paul Castellano of the Gambino family. It was virtually unheard of for a young African-American gangster to settle among the mafia's upper echelon. This territory effectively belonged to the Cosa Nostra, figuratively if not literally, and for Frank to audaciously move into the neighborhood signaled just how intrepid he had become. Agents from federal and local agencies took note. People whispered about tensions swirling around the neighbors. Some claim Castellano's men were outraged by such a blatant incursion from an outsider, while others speculate that mutual respect existed. The truth remains elusive, but Frank's presence on that upscale street underscores the scale of his upward mobility and his disregard for the lines the mafia expected smaller players to toe. Despite his success, Frank was known to have a personal weakness: cocaine. Not content just to distribute it, he reportedly indulged heavily in the product. Some who studied his life remain perplexed that his consumption never fully toppled his empire, though others suspect his drug use would eventually have spelled disaster had legal authorities not intervened. Summits and bold strategies. In the fall of 1971, Frank allegedly orchestrated a clandestine gathering in Atlanta that brought together some of the most influential African-American and Latino drug traffickers from across the nation. This was extraordinary, as many such summits in the organized crime world historically involved the mafia's ruling families. But Frank's circle was different. His aim was to improve cooperation among major Black and Hispanic distributors, to share methods on securing independent heroin and cocaine supplies, and to coordinate strategies to evade the Cosa Nostra's iron grip. Such gatherings were reminiscent of the famous mafia conventions in earlier decades, like the one orchestrated by Lucky Luciano in Havana. Indeed, some observers drew parallels, dubbing Frank an heir to titans of the underworld. By all appearances, he was forging alliances and negotiating with anyone who might expand his supply network, from Corsican traffickers to Latin American cartels. Another alleged meeting took place in Las Vegas in 1972, using a high-profile boxing match as the cover. Here again, the focus turned to distribution channels, potential collaborations, and ways to skirt direct mafia control. Unbeknownst to Frank, law enforcement was steadily tuning in. Local and federal agencies had, for some time, overlooked him, focusing on more obvious targets. That changed after these summits. By 1972, various authorities from city police, the DEA, then newly formed, the IRS, and even international bodies like Interpol began scrutinizing Frank more aggressively. They recognized him as part of a new wave of infamous syndicates, not solely Italian or Jewish organizations, and realized that the magnitude of his wealth and reach rivaled or even surpassed longtime players. Mounting pressure from law enforcement. Sensing Frank's extraordinary rise, a specially formed investigative team, sometimes referenced as Group 12, honed in on building a case. Leading participants included an attorney assigned to coordinate the probe, experienced narcotics officers, and other specialists from the tax authorities. Since Frank had no major convictions on his record, save for an old juvenile mishap, they needed more time and resources to compile compelling evidence. Yet the window for their investigation was tight, mandated at only a few months. The group's immediate plan involved wiretapping Frank's phone lines and those of his known associates, tailing his vehicles whenever possible, and combing through real estate records to identify properties purchased with suspiciously large sums of cash. Though Frank occasionally took breathtaking risks, like handing off bulky packages of narcotics in broad daylight, he also had an uncanny ability to slip away from pursuing officers. Some team members guessed that corruption within law enforcement might have tipped Frank off about upcoming raids. Others cited his naturally keen instincts. Bit by bit, the investigators were able to link him to conspiracies involving multiple kilograms of cocaine and heroin. They also surmised that he had neglected to report millions in income, exposing him to tax fraud charges. Their efforts led to a series of arrests among Frank's associates, many of whom began cooperating or turned over details to reduce their own sentences. Everything seemed to be tightening around Frank's empire. By early 1973, Group 12 felt they finally had an airtight case and secured a warrant for Frank's arrest. Word was that he had arranged to fly from Las Vegas to Los Angeles. Authorities seized that opportunity, apprehending him at the Las Vegas airport, accompanied by his girlfriend. They slapped him with charges related to drug conspiracy and tax evasion, suspecting he might attempt to flee the country if given more time. For a moment, it looked as if Frank's run might be over. Arrest and unprecedented bail. When Frank stood before the magistrate, prosecutors emphasized the magnitude of his wealth and the grave flight risk. Initially, the bail was set at a massive $5 million, which was, at the time, the highest bail amount in American legal history. Even hardened criminals took note, realizing how seriously the courts regarded Frank. But soon, negotiations reduced the bail to $2.5 million, and then further down to $325,000 under certain conditions. In an astonishing turn, Frank managed to post bail, walking out of custody before his trial. Observers argue that letting him go free was the critical misstep. He faced a potential life sentence, had enormous hidden resources, and had a well-documented ability to vanish from official radars. It required no stretch of the imagination to suspect that Frank might seize this chance to run. Yet at that moment, the judicial system had minimal illusions about how precarious the situation was. Law enforcement officials attempted to keep him under watch, but he proved elusive. The Grand Disappearance. On July 2, 1973, Frank Matthews simply failed to appear at his scheduled trial in New York. It sounded straightforward, a man skipping bail. But in reality, this event sent shockwaves through the entire structure of true crime investigation in the U.S. Here was an individual believed to have stashed tens of millions of dollars, some investigators claim upward of $20 million in laundered cash, capable of forging documents, traveling internationally, and bribing well-placed officials. he evaporated into thin air. Details emerged after the fact, indicating that Frank might have made emotional farewells to a few friends, distributing portions of his fortune among them or giving them instructions for future dealings. He apparently left with his girlfriend or mistress, who vanished simultaneously. The brazenness left investigators fuming, especially since they had suspected he would attempt an escape. The difference was, they still presumed a capture was near. Authorities worldwide launched an expansive manhunt. The DEA posted a $20,000 reward for information, one of the largest offered since the days of John Dillinger. They sent wanted posters to every corner of the country and coordinated with Interpol in Europe, believing Frank had hopped either to France, Italy, or the Netherlands. They also considered Latin America, the Bahamas, Africa, and even Asia. The short version, anywhere he went was plausible. Over time, tips from the public poured in, each one claiming to spot Frank in some locale: Amsterdam, Rome, Hong Kong, even rural pockets of North Carolina. Agents followed leads that inevitably ended with dead ends. Many repeated accounts placed him in the Caribbean, specifically the Bahamas, where he reportedly owned property. Others pointed to the possibility that he fled to Algeria, a location known at that time as an accommodating sanctuary for fugitives lacking extradition agreements with the U.S. The swirling chaos meant that authorities began spending more time chasing ghosts than uncovering real clues. Speculations and theories. As months turned to years, speculation about Frank's fate diverged into multiple avenues. Some believed he was still alive, living under an assumed identity, continuing to orchestrate or invest his hidden fortune. Others posited a darker end. If the Mafia had resented Frank's independence and brazen approach, might they have hunted him down and silenced him permanently? There are precedents for this. Frank's disregard for Mafia norms, residing in Tot Hill, kidnapping a Genovese associate, muscling into distribution lines once monopolized by the families, could easily have provoked lethal retaliation. Add to that his rumored role in revealing details that crippled certain Corsican operations in Venezuela, and one can see how a web of powerful enemies might unify to destroy him. Another angle suggests that his heavy cocaine use might have led him down a destructive personal path, culminating in an overdose. The puzzle remains unsolved. Investigators who have revisited the case highlight the near-mythic proportions of contradictory evidence. How does a man once labeled America's biggest black drug lord vanish without so much as a credible sighting for decades? The official search efforts slowly waned, overshadowed by the emergence of new and bigger drug operations, such as those run by Colombian and Mexican cartels in the 1980s and 1990s. Eventually, the authorities disbanded specialized units dedicated to the Matthews investigation, turning their resources to more pressing priorities. Rumors also exist that Frank might have tried to negotiate with investigators before his disappearance, offering partial cooperation if they would spare certain members of his organization. People question whether spurned attempts at compromise played a role in his flight. In the hearts of some law enforcement officers, particularly the older generation that toiled in the 1970s, a trace of regret lingers over how the situation was handled. Persistent enigma in organized crime lore. Over time, as new waves of organized crime subcultures rose and fell, think the reign of the Medellin cartel, the expansion of the Mexican cartels, the progression of the Mafia's 5 families, Frank Matthews' name receded into the background for the general public. Yet in circles of real Mafia stories devotees and unsolved mysteries aficionados, he loomed as a legendary figure. The man who apparently defied the entire American justice system slipped away with tens of millions and never reappeared. Writers, investigators, and criminal historians occasionally pick up the story, hoping to unravel the final page. Some remain convinced that Frank died violently not long after he fled. Others argue that his survival is more likely, citing the sheer cunning and adaptability he showed early on. If he was savvy enough to construct an empire independent of the Cosa Nostra and French Connection influences, maybe slipping overseas with false papers was child's play for him. A small cadre of amateurs, typically aligned with true crime YouTube channels or niche historical forums, continue to pick through genealogical records or to interview family members. Frank left behind children from an earlier relationship, though no publicly known contact with them has ever been reported. The question of whether the father simply sacrificed all ties to keep them safe or decided to vanish for personal or strategic reasons remains wide open. Despite occasional rumors of plastic surgery or sightings in exotic locales, no definitive evidence of his post-1973 activity has been confirmed. He has become, in the words of one detective, the ghost of the underworld, a man who soared so high and then vanished so thoroughly that one might imagine him living out his days on a remote island or else rotting in an unmarked grave at the order of an offended mafia boss. Layers of mystery. As if Frank's personal tale were not mysterious enough, conspiracy theorists add additional layers. Some believe intelligence agencies turned a blind eye to certain drug traffickers if they proved useful in broader political maneuvering. The 1970s were a tumultuous time for American foreign policy, with covert operations extending across multiple continents. Did Frank or his associates cross paths with those agendas? So-called evidence exists suggesting that the CIA sometimes cooperated with or at least tolerated specific traffickers in environments like Southeast Asia or Latin America when it served strategic objectives. Could Frank's vanishing act have been orchestrated or facilitated by a powerful shadow group? Then there is the alleged fiasco with the Venezuelan pipeline, where Frank's revelations might have shattered a significant narcotics corridor benefiting various nefarious elements. Did he inadvertently sabotage a multinational operation anchored by Corsican traffickers, prompting unforgiving reprisals from them or from intelligence figures with a stake in that pipeline? Those who adhere to such theories highlight that official documents remain sealed or heavily redacted. But the truth, as with so many dark history episodes, probably lurks somewhere between sensational rumor and prosaic reality. Legacy of a ghost. In the pantheon of notorious kingpins, Frank Matthews stands out for his youth, meteoric rise, and confounding disappearance. Comparisons with figures like Al Capone or Pablo Escobar center on their documented arrests, imprisonments, or violent ends. These men left behind firm conclusions to their sagas. With Frank, the final act remains unwritten. No body has ever been found. No undisputed sightings have placed him beyond 1973. One of the largest manhunts in American crime history yielded not a single clear resolution. This alone might be why Hollywood has shown relatively little interest in immortalizing him on the big screen. Audiences appreciate the tidy resolution of seeing a criminal jailed or killed in a hail of gunfire. A story that ends with the triumphant gangster strolling away into the sunset, pockets full of illicit wealth, unsettles the moral arc so many filmmakers want to preserve. Hence, the deeper one dives, the more Frank's saga speaks to a system outfoxed at every turn, so humiliatingly that it might prefer to bury the case in layers of historical forgetfulness. Talk to some longtime law enforcement veterans, and you will find exasperation or grudging admiration. They will describe him as cunning, calculating, and fully unafraid to elbow aside the established players of the time. Those who lived in the neighborhoods he dominated present a more nuanced picture. He was rumored to be generous to those he cared about, sometimes covering medical expenses or paying others rent. But underlying that generosity lay a chilling willingness to punish or violently coerce. His best-known nicknames in the underworld remain lost to dusty police files, overshadowed by the memory of how this man, barely in his late 20s, overcame the obstacles set by crime families that had stood unconquered for generations. Whether you believe he died soon after fleeing or lived incognito for decades, Frank Matthews redefines the notion of an unsolved mystery, a crime story that refuses to conclude. Today, a fraction of investigators and amateur sleuths remain drawn to the question, still hoping that a miraculous clue might emerge. Old files occasionally reappear, and with them the fleeting possibility that someone might break the silence. More than half a century has elapsed since Frank's exodus from the U.S. judicial system. By now, if he remains alive, he would be in his 80s. Former associates of his, if still around, have reasons to remain tight-lipped. After all, no one wants to endanger themselves with potential mafia or law enforcement retaliation. Meanwhile, The tragic rifts left in his family, particularly among his kids, underscore the personal costs of a life steeped in organized crime. Did Frank slip away voluntarily, sacrificing direct contact with parents, siblings, and children to ensure nobody could track him? Or was his fate sealed by a bullet on some lonely road, courtesy of vengeful traffickers? These questions still swirl like dust motes in a forgotten attic. The disappearance remains so comprehensive that many wonder if the simplest explanation is that he had prearranged for a hidden boat or plane to whisk him away, possibly with a well-forged new identity, and that he spent subsequent years far from the United States, drawing on hidden bank accounts. Advanced as technology is now, the 1970s were an era when crossing borders under false papers or with bribes in hand wasn't nearly as difficult as it might be in the new millennium. As for the law, once they disbanded the dedicated search units, they effectively admitted that resources were better spent elsewhere. Over time, the file on Frank Matthews receded into the background, overshadowed by wars on new fronts, from Colombian cocaine barons to waves of other international cartels. However, the memory of the intangible what-if surrounding Frank's flight keeps him an iconic figure among those who relish underworld secrets and relish the labyrinthine sagas that keep true crime watchers enticed. Why Frank Matthews endures in criminal lore. Many criminals have soared high on drug money, but few have matched Frank's boldness in forging an infamous syndicate entirely outside the direct oversight of the Mafia. Fewer still made so thorough an escape when it seemed the net had closed around them. Possibly he caught the authorities at exactly the right moment. The early 1970s featured a swirl of new agencies, overlapping jurisdictions, and a justice system unprepared for such a cunning fugitive with near unlimited funds. Then, too, Frank's path intersected with a transitional era in U.S. crime history. Old-school mobsters who had ruled the city since Prohibition were giving way to new players. The French connection was in flux. International markets for heroin and cocaine were expanding, while new smuggling routes were opening daily. Frank seized these upheavals to assemble his empire in a vacuum of oversight, even as law enforcement and the courts were still adjusting to changing times. By the moment they recognized him, his roots ran too deep. His youthful self-confidence shines as maybe the greatest hallmark of his story. He was unafraid to live among mafia dons, unafraid to convene trafficking summits to carve out new markets, unafraid to break from established protocols. That swagger endows his legend with a rebellious aura. Whether one condemns him for unleashing a torrent of deadly substances into struggling communities, or admires his audacity in flouting the powers that be, it is difficult to deny his place in the pantheon of mid-20th century criminals. Final thoughts. More than 50 years have passed since Frank Matthews took flight, leaving law enforcement, prosecutors, and countless everyday citizens stunned. He thoroughly exemplifies the drama of notorious kingpins, someone who built an illicit empire worth untold millions, influenced organized crime networks across multiple states, and orchestrated underground summits that threatened the structure of established crime families. Faced with a daunting trial and looming prison sentence, he calmly vanished, perhaps slipping overseas in the night. Some of the most persistent investigators still wonder if he died quietly or if he might be living in plain sight under another name. In a realm filled with men who either met violent ends or languished behind bars, Frank's enigma stands nearly unmatched. While many might find closure in a conclusive death or capture, mystery weaves a compelling tapestry around him. The absence of resolution invites ceaseless speculation. Each rumor of an older man seen in a small European nation or a Caribbean island surfaces momentarily, raising the question, could that be him? But so far, none has offered definitive proof. Perhaps the real coda to Frank Matthews' story is the unanswered question that continues to animate true crime devotees. Is it possible for someone controlling one of the largest drug rings in American history to vanish with millions of dollars and never be found? In Frank's case, the evidence suggests the answer is yes. No matter what final destiny befell him, be it lying in a hidden grave or enjoying a sun-kissed retirement, the records preserve the broad strokes of a young man who soared from poverty to unimaginable wealth and walked away on his own terms. Thus ends the tale of Frank Matthews, the crime underworld visionary whose resourceful mind and unstoppable confidence compelled him to challenge the established hierarchy. His name remains a point of fascination in the annals of dark history, fueling countless theories, rumors, and fervent speculation. If he ever resurfaces, it would undoubtedly become one of the biggest news stories in the domain of real mafia stories, and perhaps shift an entire generation's understanding of notorious kingpins. Until then, he remains absent, an unsolved mystery that highlights both the vulnerabilities of law enforcement and the seductive power of wealth and freedom in the shadows beyond the law.